Hello, my name is Connor. Today I would like to talk about the world Jewish conspiracy theory. I used to believe in this idea. I don't really anymore, at least not in the way that I used to. And I just wanted to go into a bit of detail about why people might believe this to be the case and if there is any truth to it. So, uh, there are several takes on this, but I'll just go into a bit of detail about the angle that I used to take on it, which was coming from a racial lens. Now, that's to see the Jews primarily as a racial group. Now, as I mentioned in my previous video, this comes from a fundamental perspective of looking at the world, which I call the Nazi one, which is the idea that the races of the world have like a fundamentally competitive relationship with each other, basically social Darwinism, and that you can expand on this as well. Like I've quite a follower of Varg Vikernes, and that's sort of like a racial pagan perspective, which is to focus on, I suppose, both the religious and racial aspects of, let's say, Judaism. So the fact that not only are the Jews, like, their religion is anti-pagan in a way, but they are also racially foreign. You know, they're a Semitic people, or, well, I suppose the Ashkenazi Jews in Europe are more sort of, they're more like Southern Europeans, but they still have obviously a lot of input from the Middle East. But in Northern Europe, they do stand out. They don't have as much in common with the Northern Europeans. So, in a racial sense, yeah, they do stand out here compared to the local population. Just to explain, like the world domination theory from this perspective, which is that it's assuming that all races are in a struggle for survival and dominance, and therefore it just assumes that the Jews are, one race trying to achieve world domination, because the assumption is that that's what fundamentally all races are doing. And their main stumbling block to achieving this is the white race, because we supposedly value justice and fairness the most. And so, we need to be got out of the way in order for the Jews to have, to be on top. And their methods of doing this supposedly includes, promoting things like abortion and contraception among white people, and promoting mass immigration of non-white people to white countries. And the effect there is basically to replace the white race with, sort of like a mixed bunch of people who can be like, the Jews' slave race, basically. I suppose a lot of this does have to do with ideas around relative racial intelligence as well. The Jews, they have, on average, a pretty high IQ. It's over 100. Europeans have a fairly high IQ as well, but the idea is that if you introduce people with like lower IQs, that it'll lower that generally. So it means that the people with the higher IQs can run things and dominate intellectually the people that are not smart. So I don't believe there to be enough evidence for this, because when I look at it, it seems as if Jews themselves they're pretty divided on like how they think things should be amongst themselves. But I'll get into detail later on about that. Well, first of all, I just wanted to go into why I first adopted this perspective. The main thing that stuck out to me was the influence that Zionists have in Western countries, especially America, and just below that, Britain, and then the rest of Western Europe after that. So the reason for it is just that you have Zionists, and they lobby our governments to send weapons to Israel to support them in their military projects, defending themselves against the Arabs or other groups that might choose to attack them because they don't believe that Israel has a right to exist as a country. Obviously, Zionism being the ideology that the Jews should have a state in, the land of Palestine, which is where the Jews originally come from. But, I saw this as a bit of a problem because it raises the issue of loyalty. It's like, well, are these Jews, are they loyal to this country, which is, founded by my people, or are they loyal to their country, Israel, which is the Jewish state, basically? And then that raised the question of like, right, well, if they're not actually loyal to this country, then why should they have the power and influence that they do? Especially when, on a moral level, I have tended not to agree with the way that they have treated, in particular, the Palestinians. So that's the first set of problems. The second comes from when you consider, like, there are Zionists out there who, on the one hand, believe that the Jews have a right to their state, that it should be in Palestine. And they also advocate mass immigration to white countries. Particularly obnoxious example of this would be an academic called Barbara Specter. She is an American Jew, but she's in Sweden at this point. And she's kind of infamous for an interview that she gave in 2010. And I've only recently actually watched the whole... It's not quite a documentary, but it's the premise is that it's basically about, at that time, there was increasing sort of attacks on local Jews there. And they were... This was an Israeli news station going around just asking the Swedish Jews, like, what they thought about it. Now, for all the other Jews that were interviewed, most of them said, it's these Muslim immigrants that have showed up here in recent years. They don't like what Israel has been doing in Gaza because at that time there had been quite recently a war between Israel and Hamas. And they've been taking it out on the Jews in Sweden. Now, Specter's perspective was quite different and shows what an out-of-touch academic she is, because she didn't acknowledge this aspect at all. She just put things in very vague theoretical terms that are very easy to take out of context and misunderstand. Because she was saying all this about, like, the Jews are like, we're being attacked because we have like a leading role to play in helping Europe to become multicultural, because Europe needs to become multicultural in order to survive. That's me sort of paraphrasing what she said. Now, I kind of need to work out the context of what she says, because the interview doesn't really flesh out like what she actually means by that. It's very vague. And that's a problem, because white nationalists just took that and go like, see, here we have a Zionist Jew advocating mass immigration to Western Europe. And it's like, well, it must surely be to, mix us out of existence or what have you. But I think what she's getting at is the fact that Western European birth rates have been declining since the 1960s and 70s. A lot of that due to the availability of things like abortion and contraception, which are all part of, advocating women's rights and things like that at that time. And in order to prop up the debt-based economies that the West has, you kind of need to bring in people from elsewhere, because if the locals aren't having enough children to replenish themselves, to work and pay taxes, then you need to bring people in from outside to just prop that up. The debt-based economy thing is relevant to the subject. I'll get into that later. But for now, yeah, I just want to just clarify that I'm pretty sure this is what she means, but that it shows just how out of touch that she is, that she seems to think that the attacks on Jews were coming from, local Swedes or whatever who can't handle multiculturalism, haven't learned to be multicultural, and they're taking it out on the Jews because the Jews are sort of have a leading role to play in helping Europe become multicultural. When in actual fact, it's the Muslims who are coming in from a different culture who don't like what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, so they're attacking the Jews there. So she hasn't a clue what she's talking about. She's one of these typical example of an academic that's so smart they're dumb. And yeah, that's what I think about it. I don't think one should take what she says too seriously, but it does raise an issue of that there is a certain hypocrisy among Zionists in the West, that they would advocate mass immigration to Western countries in order to prop up the economies here, but they probably wouldn't dream of applying the same logic to Israel, because Israel is for the Jews. But at the same time, not all Zionists see things this way. Others, like Ben Shapiro, don't think that mass immigration to the West is a good idea, probably because of these cases in which, let's say, Muslim immigrants are attacking local Jews in Western countries. And I think he disagrees as well with the idea that it is good for the economy as well. I think if they're more difficult to integrate into society, like that, you're going to be like spending more on them than they will be putting in. Maybe that kind of idea. But it just shows you that even among Zionists themselves, there is a diversity of like how they see the situation. And it also shows as well, like with regards to the concern that I had about, the loyalty of Jews to these various countries, like people like Shapiro would probably see it as like a common shared interest, because the fact is most Jews in Israel originate in Europe. At least that's where they were before they went to Israel. So Israel itself, its functions as a state are sort of modeled on Western liberal democracies. So they are more similar to us in that sense, in a cultural, political sense, than the Arabs around them, which they have more roots in like the local Islamic civilization. At the same time, though, people have taken issue with what Shapiro has said pertaining to America, where he lives, and he doesn't care about the demographic replacement of white people there. He doesn't agree with multiculturalism, but he doesn't have an issue with multiracialism, or the idea of the white people might become a minority in America, which again, to some people shows a certain hypocrisy among Zionists. I think as a whole they are hypocritical, actually, because they care first and foremost about their people, the Jews, and their state, Israel. So yeah, it is a bit of an issue when you really think about it. They would advocate for Israel in Western countries, but of course, they'll have their own reasons for living in America or Britain or Sweden or wherever rather than Israel. But again, it is very obnoxious, I have to say. And the way that Zionists operate in this manner, this is probably the closest you're going to get to a world Jewish conspiracy. I don't think it's necessarily about world domination, though I'm sure there are some Zionists out there that would like Israel to be like the world superpower, like the way that America has been. I think the primary motivation is just self-preservation, really. I don't think they necessarily have world domination in mind in the way that one would usually imagine it. This analysis wouldn't be complete if I wasn't to mention so that Zionism tends to sort of be on the right wing of the political spectrum. Now I want to focus on the left wing of the political spectrum, because typically the people who would advocate the idea of a world Jewish conspiracy see both the right and the left as working to achieve the same. What they'll do typically is they'll point to the overrepresentation of Jews in left-wing movements. They'll point to prominent examples of Jewish communists like Karl Marx, Rosa Luxemburg, and Leon Trotsky. But there's nuance to this. Of course there is. You would kind of expect the Jews to be overrepresented in these kind of movements, because left-wing politics typically appeals to people who are marginal in Western society. The Jews have, for the most part, not completely, especially in more recent times, but for the most part, historically, they were a marginal people. And in Russia in particular, the Russian Empire, they were subjected to pretty heavy persecution in the late 19th century. It makes sense that they would support, if they were having to deal with that from the Russian government, yeah, they would support like a revolutionary movement. There are specific details to this, though. The Nazis and other fascists and so on, they tended to focus on the Bolsheviks, but that's just because the Bolsheviks ended up in charge of Russia. And Jews were certainly overrepresented in them. Well, they were overrepresented in the leadership, but like most of the leaders of the Bolsheviks were not Jewish. Yes, Lenin did have a Jewish grandparent or great grandparent, but I don't think that's that relevant. You know, yeah, Trotsky was Jewish, but Jews were a lot more represented in the Soviet bureaucracy and the secret police as opposed to the leadership. Obviously, they were overrepresented in the leadership just because they formed such a small part of the population. But again, marginal people much more likely to support a revolutionary movement. There are, though, a couple of notably Jewish-dominated communist groups. One's the Mensheviks in Russia, so they're more like the Social Democrats. The Bolsheviks were like militant revolutionaries. The Mensheviks were more like bourgeois moderate. And yeah, they appealed much more to Jews actually than the Bolsheviks did. Like I said, they were still overall more attracted to the left-wing Russian movements than the right-wing ones for obvious reasons. Another notable, though, example, the Frankfurt School. Now, to give some context for them, they were communists, but they were sort of anti-Bolshevik. They didn't agree with the Soviet Union. They didn't agree with that model of socialism. Every single member of the Frankfurt School had Jewish ancestry on his father's side. They weren't all raised Jewish. They weren't all fully Jewish, but they all had that in common, which I think is interesting. I think that's an interesting point. The issue with them was that, well, they were operating in Germany during the Weimar Republic, and once the Nazis took power, they fled to America, which turned out to be a good idea for them, considering what happened in Germany during the Second World War. The issue, though, with that was that, once the Second World War finished, the Frankfurt School, the various members, their focus, one of their like philosophical fixations was how fascism could arise among a population like the Germans, and they came to the conclusion that there was a cultural element to it. And the Frankfurt School are a lot of the time associated with the idea of cultural Marxism. This is often thought to be a conspiracy theory in itself, which I'm not going to get into the details of that here, but what I will say is that there is some misrepresentation, and in fact, only one of the Frankfurt School members, Herbert Marcuse, was especially politically active. He was a Zionist, but he was also pretty critical of what Israel was doing at the time, like just after the Second World War and so on. He did see things through an ethnic lens, I think. Actually, I think because he was raised in the least religious household compared to the other Frankfurt School members that were raised Jewish, yeah, he had a mostly more secular take on this kind of stuff. And yeah, he thought that a Jewish state was necessary, so that another Holocaust wouldn't happen, basically. But at the same time, he also promoted this repressive tolerance idea, which is the idea that you absolutely cannot tolerate ideas which can lead to something like the Holocaust. And he particularly designated this as right-wing ideas, which I think is a bit of an issue because, first of all, it doesn't acknowledge that left-wing anti-Semitism can in fact exist. I suppose from his perspective it wasn't as much of a threat, but you look at how things are nowadays and you wonder if that it's different now. But I personally think that this has actually had quite a devastating effect on our society in the West, this intolerance for right-wing opinions and promotion of left-wing ones, because it has just skewed things. And in my personal opinion, which I might get into in more detail at a later point, I think that this particular way of thinking about things has sort of hijacked the Westerners' Christian conditioning. So even if, for the most part, we're not Christian anymore, a lot of us are still operating from a Christian mentality with regards to morality. And this is where I'm sure a lot of the white guilt stuff has come from, like all the bad things, like in my opinion, genuinely bad things that white people did as a result of colonialism and so on, has been used as a way for us to hate ourselves, which is ridiculous. I mean, it's like, I don't like whenever you have people that are like, oh no, the Empire, I love the Empire was great, we should do it again. No, we shouldn't. It wasn't, like, there were good things about it, but I'm not a fan of the British Empire or any of this imperial nonsense, no matter who's doing it, whether they're white or not. But like, to use that as a reason to hate ourselves is sick. So yeah, don't agree with that. And again, people will look at it in this way potentially, where it's like, oh well, it's the Jews are like hypnotizing us like whites into hating ourselves, and it's like, If that's the case, don't think it's intentional. And again, I think it's just misunderstanding piled upon misunderstanding. Personally, like, you can say it in a way, this is how I see it, where if the Nazis hadn't, been so virulently anti-Semitic, maybe we wouldn't have this repressive tolerance thing now in the West, for example. So I, to a large extent, blame anti-Semitism for the state that we're in, actually, ironically. So another aspect that I want to mention with regards to the left-wing Jews is that, specifically as a result of the Russian persecution in the late 19th century, a lot of Jews had to flee, and a lot of them fled in particular to America, which was a bit more welcoming than Western Europe, although some did come to places like Britain as well. And I honestly think this is part of the reason why Jews tend to empathize with immigrants whenever they come here, because their ancestors were immigrants as well. Which makes sense that they can understand, what it's like to be a minority population and so on. Shifting gears back towards Zionism again, because I think so. This is the final set of points that I want to make. This is probably what I would consider the most dicey, so get ready. It's the Jewish role in banking. There are historical reasons for this. Basically, in the Bible, it says that Jews are not allowed to loan to fellow Jews at interest, but they can do it to other people. Now, Jesus taught that usury is a sin, and so did Muhammad. So for that reason, the Catholic Church banned money lending at interest, usury, and the Muslims have also banned it as well. But the fact that the Jews could do it, and they were also not subject to the same laws as Christians in medieval Europe, meant that they could give out loans at interest. You'll sometimes hear people say that, that Jews were discriminated against in medieval Europe. That is true, but it's not specifically because they were Jews. It's more because they were not Christian. The reason for that is because a lot of the time, whenever you had some landowner, like a knight or someone like that, and somebody wanted to buy land from them, the process of doing so would involve swearing an oath on the Bible. And Jews would just, they're not Christian and they wouldn't do it. So from the landlord's perspective, it would be like, okay, well, I'm not selling you it then, because this is how we do things around here. But, there were probably loads of other cases in which the local lords didn't care. They didn't have this requirement, in which case Jews were able to purchase land. But to be honest, being a mostly urban population, they were just more used to money lending as a way to make a living. By and large, obviously not all of them were money lenders, like they did other things as well. Smithing in precious metals and jewels, just being merchants generally, those are a lot of quite typical Jewish occupations in the Middle Ages. But money lending was a pretty common one. And they were the only ones that were legally allowed to do it at that time. So this changed in the late 16th century in England, so Henry VIII, for example, and the broader sort of Protestant movement, they relaxed the laws prohibiting usury. So banking became pretty prominent again. But again, England provides an interesting example of, you had bankers, but they weren't Jewish because the Jews had been kicked out in the 13th century. The reason that they are important in the context of things like Zionism is because of a few families in particular that came to prominence specifically like in the early 19th century. So that would be the Rothschild family, originating in Germany, and the Montefiores, originating in Italy. Now, both these families had branches in England, and members of both of these families bankrolled the immigration of Jews from specifically Russia when they were being persecuted in the late 19th century to Palestine. So this is where you have what some people would call like a Zionist banker kind of thing, which is that, you have these Jewish families who get involved in banking, and they amass these great fortunes, which that didn't happen before, because this was in the context of Jewish emancipation in the 18th century in particular. And so there were a lot of these legal restrictions lifted on Jews, and so they could theoretically, come to a lot more prominence. I obviously want to emphasize that banking as an institution was already developing before this happened, but it is relevant that they were involved in it from an early point, especially in England, because, for example, when Oliver Cromwell took control over the British Isles, he just invited Jews back in. So even though they were technically banned from entering the country, he just kind of lifted the restrictions, and they've been able to come over ever since. And a lot of that was in the context of banking, which, like I said, had already been set up, but they just built it up even more because, again, they were historically closely involved in this particular institution or business. And it's just gone from there. I mean, especially in the 19th century, we've seen a lot of bankers and industrialists, whether they're Jewish or not, gobbling up mass amounts of wealth and ending up establishing what is known as a plutocracy, which is where you have businessmen which are so incredibly wealthy that they have the ability to influence politics and economies and so on. A lot of this is called conspiracy theory, but it's just not. It's just how it is. I don't know. It's like when you think about it, you just look at how much influence you can have when you have a lot of money. Of course, people who have a lot of money are going to, put it towards things that they think is worthwhile. And in the case of the Rothschilds and the Montefiore's, or at least some members of these families, they considered having a Jewish state in Palestine to be a worthwhile thing to put their money towards. Now, the Rothschilds, English Rothschilds in particular, are very important because of the First World War. And the local Palestinians were already not happy about all these Jews coming in with the intention to set up a state there, which obviously meant that they would have to live under Jewish laws and so on. But, as the British came to be at odds with the Ottoman Turks, who controlled Palestine at that time, because they were allied to Germany, the British had the idea that they wanted to get the Jewish financiers on their side, like members of the Rothschild family. And this is where the Balfour Declaration comes from, the promise to establish a Jewish and national homeland, intentionally vague wording, in Palestine, if the Jews would help the British to take Palestine from the Turks. They also made similar promises to the Arabs because they just wanted as much help possible to win the war. And the Balfour Declaration was addressed to Baron Walter Rothschild. But I do want to point out that a lot of people forget this. Walter's first cousin, Lionel, established the League of British Jews, specifically to oppose the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Because from his perspective and the other Jews that formed this organization, this wasn't helpful to them. They didn't agree that this would help the plight of Jews across the world. So again, it just shows you how divided the Jews are amongst themselves about what is best for them. Another example of this, a much more recent example, would be George Soros. Right, I'm gonna quote his son talking about him. It says, but he had always identified firstly as a Jew. And his philanthropy was ultimately an expression of his Jewish identity, in that he felt a solidarity with other minority groups. Again, empathy for others in a similar predicament. And also because he recognized that a Jew could only truly be safe in a world in which all minorities were protected. Explaining his father's motives, he said, quote, "The reason you fight for an open society is because that's the only society that you can live in as a Jew, unless you become a nationalist and only fight for your own rights in your own state." Quote. Obviously, that last part is describing the Zionist approach. So, Soros is an example of somebody who identifies first and foremost as a Jew, but doesn't express that so much through nationalism. He promotes causes which are sympathetic to minority groups and so on, because he feels that this is the context in which Jews like him can be safe. The problem with this is the problem that we have in our capitalist society with wealthy, mostly men, influencing things generally, which is that, especially considering how old Soros is, not being in touch with the general society. Because the wealthier you are, you're not going to have a sense of what it's like to be a common person with the various kind of concerns that they have. And I think this is a problem when people are thinking in terms of their, let's say, ethnic identity, as opposed to recognizing class and things like that, and wealth and so on. You could consider this a fairly provocative example, but to be quite honest, like, he funds organizations which promote allowing immigration to Western countries. A lot of them from parts of the world where it's mostly Muslims. And a lot of those Muslims have issues with Jews because of what Israel does. And so, some of them, we've seen that recently, they attack Jews. But not like him, because, he's probably very safe because he can afford high security and things like that. The average Jew, they don't have any of that, and they're potentially quite vulnerable to, particularly Muslims that might have an issue with them. I don't think that there's an international Jewish conspiracy that is specifically targeting white people, for example. I think that there are ways to explain why Jews would advocate for policies that will, if they continue, have the ultimate effect of reducing the white population. But I don't think this is malicious in intent. I think it will either come from a self-preservation on their part, or just being out of touch and naive and not understanding the consequences of what they're promoting. But again, the other aspect as well is that in these processes that are happening, it's not just Jews that are involved. Within the higher echelons of society, there are plenty of people of my kind of ethnicity involved as well. Now, I'm not going to sit here and just say like, oh well, all humans are basically interchangeable and everybody is fundamentally the same in that sense. It's like, no, obviously some groups are overrepresented in certain fields, in certain crimes. That is just how it is, and there's reasons for that. And yeah, you are going to see Jews overrepresented in finance and media and science, these kind of fields, and they are sort of more likely, I think, to be wealthy than the average, non-Jew. Basically, again, we can explain this by the fact that, being a primarily urban population, they tended to survive by becoming merchants and businesses which accrue wealth. And in a capitalist society which emerged in Northwest Europe, not necessarily because of them. We, and especially the Germanic worlds, have had our own merchant class that has not necessarily had anything to do with the Jews, but just also merchants and traders and so on. The kind of society that has been dominated by that particular class, bourgeoisie, Jews have done pretty well in that context because, that's, like I said, primarily urban population. Yeah, that's basically it. Just let me know what you think, if there's any important points that you think I might have missed in all of this. I look forward to discussing such things with my viewers. Thanks for watching.